we can be pleased, from our perspective in terms of that Iran has been pushed back in a significant way, has been weakened on really all fronts. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and now Iran itself geographically. Again, we don't know what's going to happen. The Ayatollah there could take a very pragmatic approach to preserving his leadership there and really acquiesce to a lot of the conditions, at least behind the scenes. He has to put up a tough front for his people to look like he's still in control and even declaring that they won the war.
Right, yeah.
But he also could just remain focused on his ideological Islamic eschatology, which is to continue to come up against Israel with every fiber of his being and every military apparatus at his disposal. So we really have to wait and see what happens. But notwithstanding that Iran is definitely in a much weaker position now than they were, a year or two ago, or even a couple weeks ago, I would say Turkey is going to emerge, in my estimation, from a biblical perspective, as Israel's major threat.
Welcome to this episode of Zion's Wire, the official podcast of Zion's Hope, where we bring you biblical insight and prophetic discussions with a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. I'm Christopher Diaz, and I'm joined today by David Rosenthal.
Hi, Chris.
President of Zion's Hope. So on our last episode, we discussed the current events that have been ongoing in Israel with Operation Rising Lion. There was a lot happening last week, and a lot has happened since.
Absolutely.
Things were just exploding in the region, and no pun on the word there.
Yeah.
But we have seen a lot transpire since last week.
Yeah, prior to or just after our podcast last week, the United States, under President Trump's direction, went over and, from the things we're hearing, amazing fashion military prowess, went over and took out 3 major nuclear sites in Iran and did tremendous damage. The assessments are still coming in, but as the days go by, the evidence seems to be more and more compelling that the U.S., and with Israel paving the way prior to the U.S. involvement, really did major damage to, if not completely knocked out, Iran's nuclear capabilities. The estimates are for years to come. So I'm sure that as more assessments come in, more is determined, and we'll have a clearer idea of that, but it looks like it was really decimated in a very significant way. And the information that is coming out through our military, I think in more transparent ways than we've ever seen before, at least in my lifetime, has really been remarkable to hear the details, the stories, the history, the development of the weapon systems, the heroism of our men and women in the military and what they did. And again, I add to that with so much that Israel and Israel's military did prior to the U.S. involvement to really pave the way for our bombers to get in there and to do the work that they needed to do. So it's been a remarkable series of events, and more is coming to light as the days go by.
Yeah, quite fascinating. Clearly, took time to plan this out. This wasn't an overnight, operation that really took a lot of unison. That had to be unified in planning this out, and
for years, it wasn't
major operation.
Yeah, it wasn't something that just fell into their laps. I think there was extensive planning for many years in this, in terms of, again, the weapon systems, the way it would all come together, the opportunity that President Trump gave to Iran, that 60-day window where it seemed like there was a legitimate effort to reach some type of an agreement, to avoid some of these things. But obviously on day 61, things changed very quickly. And you can see the coordination. The more things come to light, the more coordination I think you can see between Israel, the IDF, and the U.S. Armed Forces.
Right. And you mentioned last week this wasn't just a move of aggression by Israel to just up and stop Iran's progression here. This has been decades in the making because of the harassment, if you will, and attacks from Iran and its proxies against Israel. So they've been developing this plan, but then simultaneously, the U.S. and worldwide other nations have called for Iran to not have nuclear weapons. So,
yeah, this has really been, as you said, decades in the making. Iran directly and its proxies, really surrounding Israel, have been coming up against Israel in so many different ways. And again, it goes back to, and I think this is missed largely in the media because people kind of shy away from the religious aspect of things. But this really is a religious conflict. I would say, really, if you want to dig down to the really bare bones bottom line issue, it is completely a spiritual conflict between God and Satan, and between God's chosen people and the nations. In an ultimate sense, I would say the question is who is going to control the world from Jerusalem. In an ultimate sense, this is a conflict over the Temple Mount. This is a conflict over who will rule the world from Jerusalem, and that is it going to be God's Son, Jesus Christ, or is it going to be the progeny of Satan, the Antichrist, who is going to step forward as an imposter or a counterfeit to take what rightfully belongs to Jesus Christ because he has the right, the power, the authority, the credentials, the bloodline as the line of the tribe of Judah to rule from Jerusalem in an ultimate sense. But there is a counterfeit or an imposter that is coming, and all of this is positioning of the nations against Israel, I would say, under satanic influence, because of this spiritual conflict that rages from ancient history, really from almost the foundation of the world after the fall of Adam and Eve in the garden, all the way to the present time. And we look to the future to see how this is all going to play out. Obviously, the Bible makes it clear that in ultimate sense, Jesus Christ will reign supreme, will defeat Satan, and will defeat his counterfeit and his progeny. But in the lead up to that time, the nations will rage around Israel. And if you want, if people really want an answer to why has Israel, and I've talked to so many Jewish people through the years, the Jewish people believe that they do have a special relationship with God, but many of them do not understand and can't come to grips with why they have been so targeted and persecuted through their history. And I would say that this is a spiritual conflict. This is who is going to control the world in an ultimate sense. And Satan wants his man, the Antichrist, to step forward at some point in time in the future, and I don't think it's too far off, to control and to take or to usurp the kingship of planet Earth. And at that time, Jesus Christ, I believe, will descend from the heavens, and he will say, enough is enough, put an end to what the Antichrist is doing on the earth when he arises, and will rightfully take the throne in Israel. It'll be Israel's greatest moment.
Right. Yeah. It's, we look at the things that have progressed and what you've said, we know the end of the story, which is great news for all believers. Many will look at what's happening right now and go, okay, well, what's next as we make our way through God's story, of redemption and what's to come. And looking at the events that have transpired over the past week, it's been dubbed the 12-Day War. And we see potential for some type of peace. Reality illusion of what that looks like, but maybe talk about that.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned a 12-day war, and I think that was, it seems clear that that's something that President Trump wanted to coin as a phrase. I heard the Vice President, Vance, mention that early on. And I think that there's some significance to that from the standpoint that Israel has a history of a 6-day war. And I think President Trump wanted to make it very clear to those who were his detractors and others who said, oh, we're going to be in this long protracted war and you're going to get us into something we can't get out of and we're going to end up putting boots on the ground or whatever it may be. And I think he wanted to make it very clear. We have a specific, defined, clear objective, which is Iran will not have nuclear weapons, to go in and to take care of the potential for them to develop those nuclear weapons and then to get out and to end it. So I think that 12-day war, and that's, I think, why President Trump came out so strongly the next day after he kind of declared a ceasefire with the two sides. And that's a whole discussion for another time in terms of what happened there. I don't think, based on what I've seen, that Israel officially violated the ceasefire, but there was a 12-hour window prior to that going into effect, and I think Israel was trying to take care of some loose ends that they needed to deal with before that. And again, Israel has its own objectives. You know, the President of the United States and the U.S., we have our objectives.
Right.
Israel has their objectives, and they are the ones taking the brunt of the punishment, if you will, from the ballistic missiles coming in from Iran, and have been for decades dealing with the brunt of it and her people. So Israel has its objectives. So there was a discussion as to, and President Trump was pretty unhappy about the ceasefire and how it all went into effect. But I think he made it very clear that he wanted all things, the cessation of hostilities on both sides. And I am never a fan of, when you're talking about Israel with her neighbors and what's going on, the concept of moral equivalence. Mm-hmm. A lot of times the news media will kind of chalk it up to, well, both sides are equally at fault. And I'm not saying Israel is perfect, that her leaders don't make mistakes. All leadership does, whether it's the U.S., Israel, or otherwise. But there are some governments that try to do better and respect human life and try to abide by rules and principles of warfare. And I would say that you can't have moral equivalence in the discussion of what Israel was doing versus what Iran was doing. And I've talked to some people who casually will be observing or watching and say, well, both sides are, fighting each other, and they kind of throw up their hands like, well, it's kind of, moral equivalence. Both sides are kind of at fault. And I would say neither side is perfect, but I would say that Israel is targeting specific military infrastructure, targeting in response to decades of taking thousands of rockets coming in. And America has had a lot of loss as it relates to what Iran has done through the decades as well. That Israel is targeting specific military installations and their nuclear sites and other areas of military importance in Iran, as opposed to Iran is just indiscriminately firing, ballistic missiles in civilian populations in Israel. I don't think you can even remotely say that there's moral equivalence there. But back to the 12 issue, we talked about the 12-day war. Mm-hmm. I would also suggest, and kind of following up on what we were just talking about a few moments ago, that Shia Islam, which is really rooted and based in Iran, that Shia Islam, there are those within Shia Islam, many who subscribe to what's called 12-er ideology or eschatology. And we had mentioned in the last podcast that a lot of the media doesn't really want to talk about the religious aspect of this, but this is really at its root a religious conflict. And you have an Iranian leadership who subscribes to a Shia 12-er Islamic eschatology, which means that they believe that in about the 9th century, the 12th prophet after Muhammad, Mahdi was his name, went into occultation or divine hiding, and that they believe Allah is hiding him, and that when the world is ready, when certain things have happened, that he will come out of hiding and he will be the Islamic Messiah or the Islamic Savior to rule over the world. And within 12-er Shia Islam, you have a belief that there must be peace and there must be justice in the world. And they would say that, well, you can't have peace and justice while you have an unjust Israel in the Middle East, and therefore Israel must be eradicated. And in order for their 12th imam or that prophet to return out of occultation or out of hiding, to rule the world and issue an Islamic order in the world, you have to eliminate Israel. Some would go on to say that you have to eliminate America, where others within that religious ideology would say, well, we have to eliminate the little Satan first, Israel, so that the Mahdi can arrive or can come out of hiding. And then once he's on the scene, he'll have the power to eradicate America and to bring peace and justice in the world. So 12s are significant. A 12-day war and 12er Shia Islamic ideology are critical components that can't be overlooked in a full understanding of what's taking place. And I would throw this out there that I think this is not insignificant in terms of what just recently happened in New York City.
Right. So we had a Democratic nomination.
We had New York electing a Democrat nominee for mayor of the city of New York, Zohran Mamdani, and he's a very kind of charismatic figure, and he's youthful and energetic, but he's a democratic socialist. His policies are very radical, but even beyond that, and I would say even more significantly, when asked about Benjamin Netanyahu as an example, he said, he was asked, what would you do if Benjamin Netanyahu came to New York? How would you treat him? And he said, well, in accordance with the International Criminal Court, notwithstanding that the United States doesn't abide by the International Criminal Court, I would arrest him. I would arrest Bibi Netanyahu. This is what the Democrat nominee for mayor of New York has said. Beyond that, everything that I've seen evidence-wise is that he is his family's originally from India, and then they moved to different places, including South Africa and then to New York. His father, from my understanding, was a professor of post-colonial African studies at Columbia University, which is known as a bastion of liberalism in New York. And that Mamdani, when he was in college in Maine, was the head of Justice for the Palestinians, an on-campus group which is vehemently anti-Israel. And beyond that, that he is a Shia 12er. So if that's the case, then what's remarkable is that only days after America, under President Trump's leadership, eliminated the nuclear capabilities of a Shia 12er Islamic regime in Iran, that the people of New York nominated a Shia 12er with probably the same likely ideology as the leaders of Iran nominated a mayoral candidate on the Democratic side to become mayor of New York City.
That's quite shocking.
It's
and alarming.
Absolutely shocking.
I think you've said many times, we're moving at breakneck speed into the last days, and that makes me think of a piece that I saw actually earlier today, because I think it kind of flows with this. We see this happening in America, but also some of the progression that we'll now see moving forward. I'm going to look at some notes because this was a very interesting article I saw this morning. Right after the nuclear attack, or sorry, not nuclear attack, but the attack on the nuclear facility, President Trump held a call with Benjamin Netanyahu, Marco Rubio, and the Minister of looks like Strategic Affairs, Ron Dermer. Yeah. And there was a few points that have been highlighted from their call. So I'm just going to touch on those real quick. One, some of these are the expectations or plans that they're expecting to see roll out here pretty quickly. The war in Gaza will end within 2 weeks. Notably, the hostages will be released. It says all hostages released, which is an incredibly bold pronouncement, and especially in light of the fact that Israel is so concerned not to further hurt or injure the families of those hostages that are still in Gaza, to move them one way or the other on false hope. So if this is a proposal on the table, that's a pretty significant one. Very much, right? And that also the leadership or heading up of Gaza will be handed over to 4 Arab countries, two of those being Egypt and the UAE.
Which is not surprising.
Right.
Egypt, because of its proximity, where it borders Gaza, would be a natural, to do that, to administer. They've had a lot of involvement, with Gaza and the situation there. And then UAE, because of its significant influence in the region, a lot of the money that the UAE has, and the UAE has a normalization agreement with Israel. So it's logical for them to want to expand on that and to see other nations in the region sign on to that Abraham Accord and to normalize relations. So it's not surprising. And also the UAE has some significant investments in Egypt as well. So they have a vested interest on many fronts for wanting to see this situation resolved.
Continue that partnership.
Yeah.
And with that, actually, you mentioned, for the expanding of the Abrahamic Accords, that's one of the other notes that they expect to see Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, as well as some other Arab and Muslim countries join in and formally support this relationship.
And that would be an absolute game changer in the region. Saudi Arabia specifically, I would say, is a huge game changer potentially in the region. And I would say that not only does Israel want to see this happen, but Saudi Arabia does in a very significant way. Saudi Arabia is looking to completely reinvent itself through trade and tourism, international tourism on a very high level. Some of the things that Saudi Arabia is doing is just mind-boggling in terms of the dollars that they are spending to create infrastructure and entire new cities, sports complexes, all over the country, and a lot of development along the Red Sea for trade as well, which I think is prophetically significant too. So the Saudi Arabia component of it, I think, would be an absolute game changer. What's surprising, I would say, is who would have thought that Syria and Lebanon would even be in this discussion as potential signers of the Abraham Accord. That would be truly surprising to be able to see that, particularly in light of the fact of how quickly things are changing there.
Right. And then a couple of the other points that they highlighted here from the call, we have that Israel will express willingness for a future discussion on the two-state solution with the Palestinians.
And that's a very sticky point.
Yeah.
Because from the Saudi perspective, from the Arab Muslim perspective, the concept of a pathway to a two-state solution, if not a specific declaration of a two-state solution for the Palestinians and Israel living side by side in two autonomous states, that has really been a touchy sticking point for all the negotiations that have been going on over there. And from their perspective, they want to see clarity in that wording for their populations to be able to share that on the Arab Muslim side. And conversely, on the Israel side, they want that wording to be a little bit more vague, a little bit more future down the road, an openness to discuss it, or some type of a pathway for future discussions, or an openness, toward that, because there are major factions within Israel who are not interested at all and are very opposed to a two-state solution.
Yeah, and it hinges on the reform within the Palestinian Authority as well. Also included was that Hamas would be exiled.
Yes.
Gazans would be given the opportunity for immigration to other countries around the world. And then the other, which I thought was a big point, it says that the United States will recognize Israeli sovereignty in parts of Judea and Samaria, what we know as the West Bank.
Yeah, very significant because Israel has a lot of settlements that are, and some rather sizable populations that are living in areas what is called the West Bank. We say the West Bank. The West Bank, simply defined, is a portion of geographic land area that is on the western side of the Jordan River, that is to the north of Jerusalem, to the south of Jerusalem, and comes up to the eastern side of Jerusalem to really where the area of the Mount of Olives is. And so that's a Judea, biblical Judea and Samaria, and you have a lot of Arab populations or Palestinian populations that are living in specific areas, villages, but also some cities. in that region, and then also you have Israeli settlements that are there as well. So there is a right-wing faction within Israel, many people within Israel who say this is biblical Judaism area. It's Israel's. God gave it, and we have a right to live there and to control it. And so there are many who are living in those settlements who say we're not moving, we're not leaving. And that's been a real sticking point for Benjamin Netanyahu in dealing with his coalition and those who are on that side of the equation. So the fact that the United States would potentially put that in the mix to recognize some sovereignty of Israel over some of those areas of the West Bank would also be a significant component to any kind of a deal that would be in the works.
It's so interesting because considering the spiritual, the spiritual components that we know this all revolves around, any idea of true peace just it doesn't come to fruition when you consider that there is still a desire from 12er Islam and that Israel's gone. In their minds, Israel has to go away.
Yeah, and what really isn't being said, they're talking about these are important issues. I mean, crucial issues, and obviously we want to see peace in the region for all people. We want people to be able to live in peace, and we don't want to see bloodshed. In an ultimate sense, though, we can say from a biblical perspective that there will be no true and lasting peace until the Prince of Peace,
right,
Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus Christ, returns to rule the world from Jerusalem. And I bring that up because that is really where the crux of the issue is. It is really, everything going on in the world is really Middle Eastern centric. And if you want to have a concentric circle going closer, more to the center, you'd say Middle Eastern, Israel centered, Jerusalem centered, and in the most detail, Temple Mount centered, which is today where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock are positioned, but where Israel's ancient temple once stood. And I believe that the Bible makes it clear that there will be some type of a rebuilt Jewish temple structure that will be there. And even within Islam, even within the nations that surround Israel, many understand that within Israel's own scriptures, that there is a sense that a new and rebuilt Jewish temple structure will come at some point. And so there is this conflict. But in all of the discussions that we're seeing around Israel, in Gaza, the Golan Heights to the north, normalization agreements, all of those things, none of them are touching the real core issue, because that's the toughest one to solve, and that is the issue of who controls the Temple Mount.
Right.
And you get touches of it here and there in some of the discussions, but that issue is always put to the back because it's the most difficult one to solve from a human perspective.
I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see a little more light on that particular issue start to arise. Just because, we've been seeing even now over the past months where there are those within the Israeli leadership who have made it a prominent point to say, hey, we should be allowed to come up onto the Temple Mount and pray. And
yeah,
we're seeing that it's starting to really show itself.
Yeah. So there's movement, and there is I wouldn't say it's a large faction of Israelis, but there is a faction within Israel who is deeply concerned about the Temple Mount and wanting the opportunity to have Jewish people have the opportunity to go back to the Temple Mount, to pray, to get up on top of the mount. So I agree with you. We're going to continue to hear more and more about that. And I think within the Islamic world, you're going to have pushback saying we need to defend that area. We need to defend the Al-Aqsa Mosque from Jewish thinking in terms of any type of a rebuilt temple structure.
And now you actually just reminded me of another major important announcement, if you will, that we've seen in the past week, who actually came from President Erdogan. He gave a speech calling for the unification of all the Muslim countries.
Yes.
So thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts about Turkey, and that's probably a discussion for another day or many other days. But I agree with you that it's been very interesting to watch President Erdogan. He usually is not bashful or shy with words. He's been very bombastic towards Israel. in the last decade or so, but even more so in recent years. And he hadn't said a whole lot, and then he finally came out and called for the unification of the Islamic world, which doesn't at all surprise me because he sees himself as being the sultan or the khalifa or the head of the Islamic world, and he has aspirations to revive the Ottoman Turkish Empire. The only location or direction for that to happen is from Turkey to the south, and that's exactly what we're seeing from Turkey. So I would say we can be pleased, from our perspective in terms of that Iran has been pushed back in a significant way, has been weakened on really all fronts. Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and now Iran itself geographically. Again, we don't know what's going to happen. The Ayatollah there could take a very pragmatic approach to preserving his leadership there and really acquiesce to a lot of the conditions, at least behind the scenes. He has to put up a tough front for his people to look like he's still in control and even declaring that they won the war.
Right, yeah.
But he also could just remain focused on his ideological Islamic eschatology, which is to continue to come up against Israel with every fiber of his being and every military apparatus at his disposal. So we really have to wait and see what happens. But notwithstanding that Iran is definitely in a much weaker position now than they were, a year or two ago, or even a couple of weeks ago, I would say Turkey is going to emerge, in my estimation, from a biblical perspective, as Israel's major threat in the coming years. And that is a grave concern that I think a lot of Israelis share who are watching what is going on. And for those who study biblical prophecy, I would suggest that Turkey is a major concern as it relates to what the Bible says is coming in the last days, an attack from the north. And again, this is a much deeper discussion for another time. But I think what Turkey is doing is aligning really perfectly with what the Bible describes is going to transpire in the last days.
It's not an understatement to say we are living in unprecedented times. This is biblically, from a biblical perspective, again, what we see happening in the Middle East is major. And I'm looking forward to these discussions as we go forward. Again, we're not speculating anything, but to be watchful during these times, there's a lot unfolding before us.
And in rocket fire succession. I mean, it is happening so quickly, pardon the pun again, but so much is happening so quickly that we really, as believers, we really have to be watching and sober-minded about these things, not letting the events of the day determine our theology or eschatology, but studying the scriptures to see what does God's word have to say about these things. And then in light of that understanding and in light of the things that we're questioning and that we're reading in Scripture and asking, are we seeing these things come to pass with clarity and with sobriety? We have to look at the events unfolding in our world and say, are we getting close? And I would suggest that we are getting very close. We're moving very quickly toward the end of the age. And God's people have to stay focused and watching on what's taking place in the world and specifically in the Middle East.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place to pause for this week, and we can be watching for what happens next and even jump into more biblical conversations next week in our next episode. To our audience, thank you for watching. Thank you for participating with this. Leave us your questions, your comments. We're always interested to see those. Download our Zion's Hope app so you can stay connected with all things Zion's Hope, and we will connect with you next week. Thanks for joining us today on this episode of Zion's Wire, a podcast fueled by a passion for God, His people, and His plan for planet Earth. If you were encouraged by today's episode, share it with a friend and subscribe so you never miss a moment. Keep the conversation going with questions or comments, and until next time, keep watching, keep praying, and keep your heart fixed on God's Word.